Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the batch video for the web novel Thieves Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 1.45 to 1.48, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 1.45, Ironclad. Well, Dungeon, I've held up my side of the bargain. I've seen what you can do, and I'm ready to make a deal, and I'm ready to make it worth your while. Sophie stood at the edge of the ravine, waiting for an answer from the dark gloom. There was a strange air that existed only here in the dungeon, an atmosphere of skittering motion crawling through the dark. Every shadow was full of imaginary monsters. This time, no half-man, half-spider crawled forth to speak to her. There was only a muffled protests of the adventurers that they had apprehended. Her guards held them at spear point, only waiting for her to order to kill. She waited, and moments ticked by. Nothing amongst the spears of glass grew at the top of the ravine. Spiders crawled, navigating the shining web through which their own nets. She watched in fascinated horror as one of the fat eight-legged things closed in on the bright little bird caught in the silver threads. The poor birdie struggles, only winding it deeper into the entanglement as the giant spider slowly lowered its drooping fangs down. There was something beautiful about the moment, to hold her eyes transfixed, but she couldn't for the life of her tell what it was. She could only hope dealing with this dungeon didn't make her a little bird. But with every moment that passed without an answer, she felt more and more ridiculous. Without Kobachan, I had no messenger to send. I paused, thinking hard for a moment, and then committed the only course that I had left. I put lights of pure mana through the air, draining myself terribly to write a single word. Approach. At the same time, I sent calming and soothing waves of emotion down across my spiders nesting in the ravine slopes, trying to send them into a torpor so that they wouldn't swarm to attack her as soon as she descended. I watched the fear on her face as she descended, boots skittering unsteadily under the loose rocks of the ravine walls. To be fair, I had never expected to have a guest when I designed the place. It was a fall of some 20 feet, with much of the way cut by thorny, dense briars. Numerous little cracks of the stone hid burrows where the fisherman spider slept, ready to rise up in a sudden bloom of furry limbs should invaders stumble past, clumsy, and it took every bit of my limited control over the spiders to keep them from attacking. She slid down into the rough ravine, where the green moss lined and the earth grass might above. As strange lilac trees grew directly from my manor without the need for sun. They spread branches without leaves, pale white fruit, the color of pallid flesh hanging from their boughs. The bottom of the ravine was maybe 200 feet across, a short enough distance to cover in a sprint. Of course, anyone who actually tried to make a run for it would have fallen into pit traps hidden below the moss, anger the hordes of spiders waiting in the far wall, or even more likely be bitten by my serpents. The ground was thick with them, green beauties sliding amidst the moss and the stones, hunting for little birds come to peck the insects from the ground. Above, spidery bodies crawled over the canopy of glass and hooded the ravine. She was in the heart of my territory now, carefully watching her feet, glancing up every now and again at the shadows, fearful of the spiders above descending. I could have spoken now, with plenty of moss and greenery in to twist to my words. I let her stew in fear for just a few steps longer. The time was welcome because I needed to think. The prophecy Strix had delivered, the promise that she would be an arrow cast to the gods for me, was tempting. Very tempting. The result, Carlton, being destroyed, less so. My relations to the city weren't friendly, but they were symbiotic, in the way that a parasite needed a host. I had built myself to intertwine with Coltern. Put the prophecy aside for a second, and I had a different facet of the deal to see. I didn't like Sophie, and I didn't like for a moment to believe that she was trustworthy. But with a contract I could control her somewhat. Even killing her now, while I had her in my power, wouldn't be as effective. I would have her family and her political allies furious with me, bent on my destruction. In a way, that very fact that she was untrustworthy made her ideal trap in a contract's binding powers. Besides, I didn't need to like mortals. I probably would never be fond of any of them, besides my own creations. What I needed was ones that I could work with, and did Sufi fit that description? From a third perspective, Sufi had kept her end of the deal. She would keep her end of the deal, I knew, until the moment that I was useless to her. And how could I ever be useless? There was so much to gain from me, and I only needed to maneuver, so more was always on the horizon, promised but yet to be delivered. My glass fawn descended into the valley from the far side. He had come up from the river yesterday, unharmed by the water, by simply able to walk home from underneath. I lifted a stone slab from the earth, carving into the surface. 1. Sufi Halfhand shall do nothing to harm the dungeon or expose its secrets. Looking at it through the lens of the prophecy, I should take the deal and bind her as an ally. The only question was whether I trusted the little prophet Strix enough to change my entire course based on her words. And in a way, I did. 2. This dungeon shall provide a achievement for one member of the Halfhands clan each month, other than Sufi. I saw her face go rigid. She would greatly benefit from the added strength of her clan, yes, but she herself would be the one who never received my gift. 3. The Halfhand clan shall teach the dungeon all it knows about jewel setting and spellcraft. Anger. She was angry, and showing it her good hand cold into her fist. I needed to sweeten the deal, to add a little honey to even out the sour taste of asking for her clan's secrets while offering, personally, nothing in return. It wasn't impossible that she'd lose control of the clan. If others surged to power while she remained behind, mortals were fickle like that. 4. Each month the dungeon shall provide 2 golems personally loyal to Sufi Halfhand. She stared at my terms for a long time. 5th, she called out, the dungeon shall tell Sufi Halfhand before it makes plans to surface world. Sufi Halfhand shall do likewise for the world below. I added it, but not without a price of my own. 6. Sufi Halfhand shall discover the purpose of Olin Fram's experiments on the dungeon's behalf. It was weighed in my favor despite her added clause. I had to warn her, but not actually restrain myself on her behalf. She would be bound not to harm me, something that she didn't miss. But as she stood there chewing her lip, she nodded. Holding out her already bandaged left hand, she conceded to the terms. Take my blood then, it is time we meet in person. I agreed entirely. Sufi knew the core was a type of gemstone, containing a rift of pure mana within. She had expected them to look the way of the mental plane as well. But as it faded into the dark of the void realm, that wasn't what she saw. There was a gem, yes, glowing like a green star amongst the night, but it was at her heart that the beast, unlike any that she'd seen before. What she saw was a snake and a spider, a rat and a man. It was all of those things and none of them. Its flesh was translucent, made of shadow and light in geometric planes like a facet of a gem. It shifted constantly, folding in and out of itself like a kaleidoscope in motion. But most of all, it is constantly changing form. She saw the beast, a terrifying primal shape that struck a chord of terror, something that felt recognized out of a nightmare. Its thoughts washed into hers like a wave. They were inhuman, cruel, and cold. It thought in the long, dark terms of the earth and in a language of paranoia and hunger. Its only warmth was the satisfaction in creation, and that she knew well. In many ways they were alike. She had the same restless hunger and the same paranoid drive that kept her up at night. The same love to slowly working her will into reality through the acts of creation. They were alike, but she was mortal, and it was a cold, alienated being. Something about that, how far it was from human truly, how relentless without mercy or morals, made her suddenly regret the deal. But it was too late. She was bound in contract as the stone tablet descended. End of chapter 1.46. Freedoms. Koba-chan was alone. Not truly alone. The unicorn trotted by, happy to be rid of its shackles, long legs trembling as it took its first steps of freedom. But outside the dungeon, beyond all the diminishing and intricate ecologies of all-seeing eyes of the Maker, alone that it had no role to fill, no place to be. He was simply existing now, outside, in the bright sunlight that streamed through the branches of the willow grove, watching muddy little fish dig themselves into the soft earth and the lakeshore and burst out into ambushed little insects. Tiny waves swept to the surface of the lake, their crests shining gold. He leaned down, letting the cool waters peel the blood from his injured hand in a ribbon of yellow. It felt good. Soon he was lifting cupped handfuls of cool, clear water to his face, swallowing eagerly, until there was a cold ache in his stomach. Freedom was strange. Freedom was drinking water until your stomach hurt and feeling glad you could. Gobo-chan sat back, fingers brushing through the tall grass, uncovering countless little insects thriving there. They were silly little things, no deadly bites, no poison stings. He meandered. A ladybug fluttered out and landed on his hand, crawling slowly over to the nacre-covered palm. He turned his hand over, but the tiny thing clung on, scuttling up between his fingers. "You are ridiculous," he informed the bright little insect. "How could you even kill a man?" It took no bother at his words, only fluttering away when he leaned down and blew it away. Nature was confusing. There were still patterns, yes, to the way that the grass grew and how the flowers bloomed in symmetry. But they were meaningless patterns, not the sign of a purposeful creation. The way that the branches split overhead, winding through the sky like veins, or the way that the bark split into rugged plates, these were beautiful little details that had no name signed on them, no creator. A confused Gobo-chan did not exist within the greater mind, interpreting the thoughts of the maker through his work, to simply be a part of the chaos as the wind swept through the grass and the ripple waves. He was curious, and he rose up off his 8 legs and began to walk, moving past the edges of the grove. Outside the world was a carpet of lush green spread over rolling hills, dipping down into valleys where the land was divvied up into squares of growing crops and tilled earth, the evidence of human hands at work. Farmhouses bloomed like mushrooms of geometric certainty amongst the random rise and fall of the hills. A fire raged in the distance, sending off towers of grey smoke as it toppled in the wind. He paused, and then he went back, laying his hand on the unicorn's back. It was like him, a creature made of blades. Together they walked towards the distant fire. Gobo-chan clutched the flower bud of the god had given him in one hand, the promise of healing Aurum as a precious of his own life. If he was being truly loyal, truly faithful to the dungeon, he wouldn't have taken the risk of going at all. Something just pulled him. As he arrived, he found a little village in chaos. The thatched rooftops were burning, the fire pouring into the houses below with great molten drops, flames slowly collapsing the buildings from within until they gave way, puffing up huge clouds of ash and flitting sparks as they fell. People fled, clutching the few possessions of their family. Gobo-chan was the spectre of death to them, as they saw him striding calm through the chaos and shrank back, or fell to the knees and prayed. He simply watched. His role here wasn't any sort of heroics to save anyone. The thought had never crossed his mind. Gobo-chan was simply curious. The galloping hooves drew his attention. The rider with a waving red cloak was rushing towards him, an axe in hand. The man swung the axe on Gobo-chan's throat, and the arachne simply raised an arm, letting the blade shatter and rebound against the nacreous hide, the force knocking the man down from the saddle. His horse galloped on while he was left lying in the dirt. Before he could rise, Gobo-chan looped over him, a blade-tipped left leg hovering over his throat. "Tell me what is happening here," Gobo-chan said, as calm as death. "Revolution!" the man spat out. His face was red with fear. Spittle ran down his bushy beard as he gasped and reached for the dagger in his belt. Gobo-chan simply pushed his weight down. That's all that it took. A little Golem's first hurdle was to heat up the metal hot enough to work with. The giant oven of the dwarves used to be too big for him, even the radiant heat that washed out from the blazing mouth enough to make his clay hide begin to dry and crack. He would need his own. Luckily, he could shape the earth. For 3 days he lifted tiny cobbles up out of the street while the city slept, carrying them methodically up to the secret den in the loft of the forge, where the earth-shaping he melded them together into a crude forge, and took scraps of coal from the workshop below, building a little foundry. Metal scraps and shavings went into a crucible, a little cup of clay. Finally, everything was ready. The pigeons who lived amongst the rafters cooed and barbled in confusion as he struck sparks from the piece of flint with an old nail salvaged from the forge's floor. The fire sparked and lifted up, raging hotter and hotter in the stone oven. The metal scrap in the cup began to glow like embers, losing its shape and puddling into a liquid iron. That was when the cup cracked open and spilled the metal across the coals, smothering the fire. The first time that happened. The second crucible was made of stone. The third was thickened stone. The third time he worked the stone with his magic, pushing it denser and denser until he could barely lift the resulting cup. This time it held. The bounty of molten metal bubbled as it spat in the crucible, and his little golem reached out with his magic, making the stone slowly close and form in the cup as a sealed sphere. For the smiths who worked below, castings were a crude process, the first step being shaped with a metal and hammer and an anvil. The golem could do more. He could mold the cast while the metal was inside, shaping the metal by proxy, pushing then sculpting instead and beating with a hammer. It sat there for hours as the coals cooled into embers, into ash, slowly compacting the remains of the stone orb smaller and smaller, pressing the metal into a more definite shape, giving it the form of a ring. Finally, it lifted out the soot-covered stone ring, crudely shaped, with a whirl of a spark of magic. The stone cracked and fell away like fragments of an eggshell. Within was a double band of iron braided into a twisting helix. It was a good first attempt, but flawed. The detail wasn't there. The fine work that made the finished product sing. It didn't speak. It had no voice. The little golem sat and pondered, looking over what it had made. Something was missing. There was a rhythm in the golem's head, a tune sung by the dwarves in ancient halls, where the light of their lanterns were fireflies in the dark beneath the earth. A drinking song, a marrying song, a warring song. The string was none of those, and it needed to be all of them, or the song would haunt the little golem until it had been taken out of its head and made real. It sat with its legs crossed, its shapeless head popped up against one hand, thinking as hard as it could think. End of chapter. Chapter 1.47. What the Rats Saw. Words were a funny thing. One small choice altered the entire meaning of a phrase. For instance, Sophie had stipulated that I couldn't make plans without telling her once the contract began. Not that I had to tell her all my plans. Plans I had made before the contract were effectively exempt. So, the moment before the contract took effect, I made plans to kill Sophie Hoffand, not as a weapon I intended to use, but as a weapon to hold in reserve, always poised to strike. I had no doubt that she had found a similar way to justify her, so that the contract's rules would allow her to wriggle through me and strike at me. It would be harder for her, of course, and I had been able to include a clause that prevented her from acting against me at all. And she hadn't known the wording for more than 5 minutes before the contract descended. 5 minutes to come up with a plan to kill me, without harming me, and she had managed to do that. I had touched her mind in that moment we made contract, felt the cold steel intellect and burning ambition there. Yes, I would have to assume that she did manage. Thankfully, I had my own hidden dagger against her now. The first step of my plan was to shadow her. Moving to follow her while she was still in the sewers was too obvious. So I had my rats enter the surface world and move above, waiting for them to emerge from one of the human-sized entrances. Sure enough, she came up in the market square, clutching a clay pipe from one of her comrades and trying to smoke the smell of the sewers out of her nostrils. She handed back it to the captain, the same dwarf that I had granted the first attunement, the attunement of Gleam. We followed her from there into their own town of dwarves. The buildings here were close-knit, almost running together, with 3 or 4 shallow stories stacked together into a low-roofed little hovels. For all the dwarves appreciated their finer beauties in metal and sculpture, they were still willing to live in cramped, myopic conditions in a human world would have called a slum. The only building that stood tall around were the workspaces and alehouses, which were built with posts instead of walls, open to the air and sunlight as the apprentices and masters within sung to the ring of the hammers. The brewmasters tended their frothing cauldrons, and their daughters served up tankards of sweet mead and sour ale. There were temples of dwarven life, while the lowly houses were merely places to sleep. I couldn't help but wonder what it was like to maintain halls where the strange spirit of industry had hundreds, if not thousands of years to grow, where the stone had been worn down by the passing of generations of dwarves, and carved by their finest sculptors, where the riches of their entire empire were displayed openly as a common treasure, so unlike how the humans hid their wealth away from sight. Everywhere my spies looked, there were statues. They did not stand alone on pedestals, but were mixed into crowds, captured in the perfect imitation of life. It took a moment to realize that they weren't amongst the living. They could have been real dwarfs frozen in the bronze and common moment of their lives, sitting in a mead hall table raising a glass, or standing sweeping a stoop of the house, in the workshops, and even in the middle of the street here. The dwarves lived their lives this way, surrounded by the memories of their ancestors and the talent of their sculptors, passing the dead on the way down the streets. It was oddly inspiring. Sufi's house was a sprawling compound of a dozen of individual blocks of dwarven slum arranged in a kind of living wall, surrounding a central garden and a single tall house. She was not a normal dwarf, and she didn't deign to live in a commoners did. Everything about her ambitions could be seen in how that mansion towered, closer to the governor's villa than the low round houses of the dwarves. It was there that ran into the first problem. My clever little wallflowers had kept out of sight, moving above, scuttling up walls and peering over the edge of the rooftops. Now a wall presented itself. A thin barrier of spellwork sat over the mansion and surrounding the gardens. One by one the guards slipped through and presented little tokens of bone around their necks, while Sufi only needed to press her hand on the web of golden lines for it to briefly flicker and let her pass. I had no such trinket to get by. I was left in the cold, my spies settling down to perches in the surrounding environments, awaiting my further orders. I would need to think on this one. My rats descended down the stairs that I had made from the failed descent to the second floor. The elements had come out of nowhere and wreaked havoc, and it was time that I learned where they came from. My senses didn't extend down into the rift that they'd torn in the foundation of my dungeon, and so I was forced to send spies down. As they touched down in the abandoned second floor, they found it much as I'd left it. The stone tree still stood caked in the jagged arrangements of salt and crystalline snow, the faces carved into the trunks worn and withered with expressions of sorrow. The flowers still grew, blanketing the 7 plateaus and extending across the gaps between the interwoven canopies that hid the deadly falls. An adventurer could take a step, expecting flowers to mean there was solid ground beneath, and plummet to their death on the spikes below. No, I was quite pleased to see that much of my damage was minimal. The elementals had ceased their rampage as soon as we retreated, withdrawing back into our dens. As I watched, the presence of the rats began to wake them. The stones cascaded out of the long tears in the walls, deep rifts in the floors, and stones rolled and bounced and formed, starting at the legs and working up. The imitation of a hound, but with 6 legs, a back covered in spines of obsidian, and cool, cruel eyes of quartz. My rats scattered, and they were light enough to run right over the places where the flower canopy extended over the hidden fall, scampering over the bridges of roots, while the hounds couldn't follow without tearing through. Instead, the elemental beasts leapt the gap in the huge shows of strength, or came rushing down across the glass bridges that connected the plateau tops. That was what I was waiting for. A second team of rats burst from the stairwell, heading directly for the closest gaps in the wall from which the hounds had emerged. One of them carried a rock of glowing stone in its mouth, lighting the way as it dove into the crevice. It was a tight squeeze, even for my ratty beauties, as they climbed through the twisting, narrow crack of stone. A strange shiver ran down my spine. Mana. The air was dense with coiling, powerful mana completely unlike my own. That was why I hadn't been able to see through the usual method. The field of mana that surrounded me gave me my vision and repelled the foreign energy. And then a thin glow lit the way, the color of amber. the lead rat emerged into a widening cavern where the floor pooled with an ochre liquid, all of it shining light inherent as more dripped from the glowing drops of the stalactites above. The walls were made jagged, rough crystals of honey color. It was like the inside of an enormous geode, and the light that shone with little spars of honey crystals on the walls became solid, condensing into liquid and pooled into a basin. The liquid was the purest of mana, condensed into physical form. I could feel the intrusion stirring the beasts outside into a frenzy. Hounds turned back from crashing the decoys, congregating towards the true incursion team. The earth began to shake, tremors I felt all the way up to the second floor. The enormous rock lizard began to haul itself out of the ground rift and split the fifth plateau in half. But I couldn't turn back now. I had to know. At my orders, the lead rat approached the pooling mana. It reacted at its mere presence, drawing up into ribbons of liquid amber that flowed through the air and reached for him. It touched him and ran through his skin as if it had no physical presence. And then he began to change. The rat twitched and convulsed in the ground as his legs gave way in the attack of spasms. Horns erupted from his brow, tusks from the edges of his mouth. Growing in slow motion, fur froze to the rocky pallets, looking like an armadillo with the banded layers of stone, and its eyes took on an amber hue. Stone hounds were coming fast. The rat arose from his baptism, changed. Spurs of bone jutted from his head in a rough crown of tusks carved out with his mouth. And he was now so large I feared that he might not be able to squeeze back through the narrow path. He was armored now, yes, and I could feel his organs had shifted as well, his bones solidifying to crystal. This raw mana was precious stuff, and I could have licked my lips with greed as the ratty crew fled, scampering back up the stairs in triumph. It seemed as though the elementals were born from unnatural mana deposits, and better yet, that these deposits came in two forms, a powerful liquid that changed when it was touched, and a crystalline form with unknown properties. The sooner I experimented with the stone hounds that had damned lizard, the better. Stone tusk rat, born from the exposure to earthen mana, the common vermin has been infused with the power of sense of gems and precious metals, even within the earth, can tunnel at tremendous speeds to find them. End of chapter. Chapter 1.48 Familiar Faces. The half-man, half-cat gladiator lurked in the middle of the ring, waiting for them. Confidence and assured victory was written across every inch of the muscle as it swaggered about, its four-legged lower body pacing with the grit of the arena. On three, then, Umi had no weapon, but she confidently balled up her fists. Her fishing rod lay on the ground next to the beast, waiting for her, and all she had to do was survive long enough to reach it. Drivlin would have bet good money that she would die on the way there. On three, the speckled mage confirmed, lifting his hand and beginning to spell work glyphs with the air of intricate twisting motions. 1, 2... The diagram spread into a blazing circle and collapsed down into a blazing point of golden light from the dark expanse of a sphere of the blue sky, edged with rotating golden runes. It was beautiful. The horizon was the color of sapphires, an ocean of the sky. Clouds sailing like ships in the endless azure, warped at the edges by the fisheye lens of a spherical portal. 3. Open. Wind burst forth from the sky portal, lifting the sand of the arena into a tremendous cloud as Umi and Trevelyan ran forward, yelling in bravado and terror, respectively. The gladiator burst forward to meet them in a charge, but, for a second, lost sight of the two in the rippling waves of dust pouring from the sky sphere. Then a shadow caught its attention, and it plunged its trident down, narrowly missing Umi as she ducked away. Panic written clear on her face. The fishing rod was still out of reach, and it wasn't looking like she had time to make another dash for it. The gladiator lifted up an arm for another blow, and this time the dust had all been pulled away, leaving no cover to escape. The arm came stabbing down. A fishhook sailed through the air, snagging the back of the gladiator's arm and pulled, twisting the blow aside so Trevelyan could escape as his features returned back to normal. Behind the centaur beast, the real Umi stood with a fishing rod in hands. Open! the mage pronounced, and the second sky sphere blossomed from his designs. The one showed a cold, cloudy night, full of endless grey. Mist poured forth, carried out in the wind, with it full of an entire arena with a sea of fog. Only the gladiator was tall enough to stand above the waves of mist that had lifted and crashed against the swirling like a true ocean. The gladiator rushed towards the mage, identifying the real threat now, but it found its footsteps slipping. With the wind pouring out from two portals now, the sheer force was sending the beast sliding back. Umi darted out of the fog, delivering a crushing blow to the beast's back leg, and vanishing again as the gladiator dropped to one knee and was slowly repelling by the roaring of the wind. Open. Third portal, and now rain pelted through the arena, the wind redoubling once more. Trevelyan had to sink into the ground to keep from being thrown about, with the gale created dozens of small, spiraling whirlpools in the mist. They rushed towards the gladiator, smashing into him with a force that sent him reeling, unable to fight back as Umi vaulted through the air and the mist to strike him again across the arm. The golden trident fell from the numbed fingers, and the gladiator swung its net in the mist. Umi was already gone. Open! A hail tore into the walls like a storm of tiny arrows, each piece a thumb-thick shard as sharp as the devil. Trevelyan screamed as he covered his head, his protest lost in an all-consuming howl of wind. The sound of water being sucked down a drain, but amplified until it took on a shrill, screeching tone, a daredevil shriek. The gladiator could no longer advance, even slowly. With every second, it was being pushed back. 4 spherical portals, 2 different skies floated above the mage's shoulders as his hood flapped back in the wind, revealing a bald head carved, not tattooed, but carved, with runic letters written in scar tissue. Open. Snow filled the air. Like tiny flakes of rapidly began to steal the warmth from the world, each gust of wind seeming to pull a life out of Trevelyan, turning his skin hard as frost. Snow built up on his collar, filled his boots, stung the tiny drops of utter cold against his bare face. A 6th portal was forming letter by letter. The mage was pulling golden diagrams from the air and weaving them into a singular design. Trevelyan prepared to die, killed by his own ally. Oh, the indignity. The world cracked open in a peal of thunder as the 6th sphere opened, full of angry scars of purple lightning and a black mass of clouds. Crackling threads of electricity poured across the mage's hands as he held them forward, directing the energy towards the beast that stood in his way. A single moment of brilliance lighting up the world. A second later, the thunder hit, deafening Trevelyan as he lay blinded through his eyelids by the burning light. And yet, somehow he heard the voice speak. It spoke not through the world of sound, which was presently obscured by the deafening aftermath of the thunder, but into his skull. All but one shall proceed. The majority must choose the unworthy one. When his world was restored to him, swimming back into focus as a loud, piercing note rung in his ears, he saw the gladiator was dead. Rather violently. Definitely dead. Smoke rose from the charred corpse where it had stood at the center of the arena, and it was good as a golden door. Staggering to his feet, Trevelyan limped towards the door. A shard of ice had torn through a rather nasty gash down the side of his calf. The mist, rain, and ice were slowly fading, the wind ready dying from the air. He was wandering through the grey world as 2 fellow shadows emerged, also heading for the door. When the last of the fog faded, Umi, and the nameless mage stood together in the Golden Gate. Ah, damn! I was going to vote for him. Which one of you has? He glanced between them. Neither had the fishing rod. It lay tangled on the doorway's edge, blown there by the wind. So what? I dropped it, Umi said. Reaching down, Umi stomped where her fingers were about to be and sent her flinching back. Can't even act like me, Umi scoffed. Look at his body. The way he holds himself, he's an idiot. I'm graceful. I wasn't paying that much attention to either of you, I'll admit. Pushing his glances up on his nose, the mage gave a look between them and shrugged. He froze, uncertain. Umi shifted her hand behind her back and turned so only Umi could see her, and she said, in Thieves' sign, there is only one way that we're both safe. Agreed, Umi signed back. On 3 then. 1, 2, 3. Neither of them moved. The mage paused, unsure why both companions had just sprouted audacious, sly grins. 2 foxes playing the exact same game. For real? One Umi asked. Sure, the other replied. In unison, they both raised their fingers and pointed at the mage. You. His mouth dropped slack and then curled up, twisting into a grimace of absolute anger just before the spell tower caught him. There was a blur, and the man who'd brought down the sky was no longer there. One of the Umis calmly shifted back to Trivlin, while the other picked up the fishing rod and slung it over his shoulder. I didn't catch your real name, she asked. Oh, Trivlin. As he offered her his hand, the door behind them silently creaked open. End of chapter. And that concludes this batch video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so down below. Until next time, I hope that you all have a good one. And I'll see you all in the next video. Cheers.